This is side 2 of tape 5 of a series of tapes on the history of Hawarden, Iowa, and the Big Sioux River Valley prepared by Proctor Maynard. See the other side of this tape and earlier tapes for an explanation of the circumstances under which these tapes have been prepared. On the other side of this tape, I have been discussing at the end of the tape some of the characteristics of stores of the period that I went through my boyhood in Hawarden that had not been discussed on previous tapes. The last topic that I didn't have space for on the tape on the other side would be the nature of store partnerships. Most of the stores in Hawarden in the period from, perhaps just before World War I until the Depression in the 1930s, most of the business organizations of those stores, or at least many of them, were partnerships. Two families or more making their living out of the store. Today it is my observation that there are very few stores that independently owned stores, as most of these would have been in that period of time, in which two families or more can make a living out of the store, unless some of the families are simply employees of the store. The chances for a store to provide a full partnership for two people or more are much more reduced today, much less today than they were in the period between about the time that World War I began. This is, of course, the time when I would be aware of what was going on, until the Depression began. Today, nearly all of the stores have to be single enterprise stores. I think I'll change the nature of the topics a bit to deal with some of the styles and fads of the period in question. This was a period in which shoes for men changed from nearly all full-size, ankle-high or less, but regular shoes with tops on them, to the Oxford style. I can remember my father discussing the question with my mother as to whether they ought to buy Oxfords for me. My father feeling that Oxfords might mean a weakening of the ankles because there was no support for the ankles. I think there was a good deal of discussion, if I remember right, about this in newspapers and magazines and various sources of that site. The period after World War I was a period in which, among other things, girls wore, for a time, very tight skirts, so tight that they had to take Chinese woman-like steps, and had a terrible time climbing up into cars, getting up onto the running board, or getting up in streetcars, anything of that sort. The skirts were so tight. This lasted for perhaps 2 or 3 years. I don't recall just exactly how long. Men went through a period in which long pants were very tight. The ideal pant was one in which the calf of the leg, the bulge of the calf of the leg, showed very clearly in the pants. At one point in this period, there also were peg-top trousers. That is, the calf part of the trouser would be very tight, but it would flare out into a what was called a peg top. Sometimes it was just impossible to put the tight pants on over shoes, and you had to be sure you had your trousers on before you put your shoes on, or you had to take your shoes off in order to get your trousers off, because they were just too tight to make it over the shoe and the heel and all the rest of it. At another point in this period, knickers and what were called +4s caught on. This was partly because the golf game caught on, and in Scotland the golf game had involved the wearing of this kind of clothing in Scotland and England, where golf had been played widely much earlier, and so that fashion came to this country. There was a period of extremes in fashion. During this period, too, you had women going in for all sorts of fancy hats, and every town supported one or more milliners. At one time, Hawarden had 2 very active millinery stores. There may have been more, but I remember 2 stores. One of them in particular, Mrs. Croon's store. Mrs. Croon was a widow with a couple of daughters, and she had a store on Main Street in which she had various styles of women's hats and was very good at creating styles. Almost every community had one or more milliners whose specialty was creating some kind of hats. All sorts of things were used on these hats. Feathers, of course, this led to some of the conservation movement. Also, vegetables, fruits, flowers, just about anything that the imagination could cover, and lots of ribbons, lots of silk, lots of bows, all kinds of decorations of one sort or another. There was a period, too, in which men wore spats quite a lot. One of the famous dancers of the time had worn spats and popularized them, and men wore them. Later on, when I lived in the Upper Peninsula, I tried to buy a pair of spats because we had lots of snow up there, and I sometimes didn't want to put on overshoes to go downtown. I'd rather put on a pair of rubbers, and I found that if I had a pair of spats, I could keep my ankles from getting all snowy. I had a hard time finding a pair, but I finally did find a pair. First time or two I wore it, some of the other teachers kidded me about it and so on, but it proved to be a practical thing, and 1 or 2 other teachers did go in for spats also. This, of course, was, for boys of my age, the period of transition from short pants to long pants. And the question always arose as to how soon you should change to long pants. And the boy who changed to long pants always got quite a ribbing from his fellows. I remember that in my own family, my father and mother discussing whether they ought to get long pants for me. Being short, well, of course, it was a little more of a problem. But the main reason for shifting from short pants to long pants was the impossibility of finding short pants suits that would be large enough otherwise. And so I think it was probably in the 8th grade that I made the shift from short pants to long pants and had to take the ribbing that everybody else got when they made the shift. I probably made it a little bit ahead of some others, and as a result, took a little more of it than some of the others did. I could also comment on some of the changes that occurred in appliances during this period. When I was a small baby, I lost the tip, or I took off the tip of my finger by sticking my finger in the gears of one of the early automatic washing machines. My father took the tip of the finger and me to a doctor. I think this was in Vermillion, South Dakota, and the tip was sewed back on and did turn out successfully. I today have a scar on the tip of my finger where the accident occurred and where the tip was replaced. The the gears on early day washing machines were not very well enclosed, and a good many accidents of this sort happened. The first washing machines, first mechanical washing machines, usually had some kind of a wheel or some kind of a lever to move the clothes plungers back and forth. There were different styles of clothes plungers, but there was a mechanical advantage to whatever was used, and the women regarded themselves as having gotten away from the washboard and the wash tubs when they got one of that kind of washing machine. A little bit later on, they were electrified with a motor underneath, usually a big heavy motor, and one that wasn't very well protected from water and soap suds and so on, so they frequently failed. But the washing machine did begin to be mechanized. Wringers began to be attached. The first wringers did not have a safety brake on them, as later wringers did. Most wringers that had the attached rollers at the top of the later period had a safety bar that somebody could reach up and hit with their hand if they caught their hand or some other part of the body in the wringer. And I might say that some of the stories, which I won't go into here, about parts of the body being caught in the wringer were true. This did happen. And it was, of course, an extremely painful experience, especially when there was no safety release. Irons changed from the big heavy sad irons that had to be heated on the stove to smaller irons that were heated on the stove that had removable handles, and then eventually to the early day electric irons. There were also some charcoal irons that had a charcoal burner on them, and gas irons, I expect they were considered to be. And then finally the electric irons came in. They were usually big heavy irons at first. The steam iron came along, I think, probably just before or just after World War II, so that it was a much later innovation. Carpet sweepers appeared on the scene and were considerable help. Vacuum cleaners and vacuum systems for the house came at about the same time. In fact, some homes had vacuum systems for the house before they had vacuum cleaners. One of the prestige items was to have a vacuum system for the house. They weren't as successful as you might think, but in families that could afford it, the vacuum system was built into the house, just as the furnace piping was, and you had a hose that you connected in each room, an outlet that you connected in each room, and you had a tank for storing the dust down in the basement. The early vacuum cleaners were only moderately successful, but they were much easier to use, of course, than the carpet beaters. During most of my boyhood, carpet beating was still the standard spring practice. You put the carpets out on the line, and then the father or the boys or the hired man or somebody had to use a carpet beater to clean them. Water heating was at first largely by coils in the furnace or in the stove, those houses that had furnaces, and in the kitchen stove of those houses that had a stove that could accommodate a coil. Usually there was also a water tank on the stove that you could put hot water in. In many homes, they saved the rainwater, either in a cistern or in barrels. Those barrels became sources of mosquito larvae in the summertime. And used the rainwater for washing their hair and various other things of that sort, because Hawarden water was quite hard, and it was hard to get the soap out. Nearly all stoves were wood stoves. There were some electric stoves, but they were not at all common. There were a number of types of oil stoves. Some of them were of the pressure type, and these sometimes were rather dangerous because they could explode. One did in the area in which I lived, and the young girl died. I think I've described that on another tape. The fact that when she died, some of the neighbor ladies had wanted her to be wrapped in sheets soaked in heavy boilings of tea. It wasn't done, to the best of my knowledge, and I guess the girl was so badly burned that she couldn't have recovered anyway, but with the burn treatment they had at that time, but it was typical of the kind of incident that sometimes happened with the pressure-type oil stoves. Our house up on the hill, we lived in two houses in Hawarden, one up on the hill and one near the Catholic school. The first one was near the Catholic school, later up on the hill. And our house had been owned by a banker, built by a banker, probably shortly before 1900. And at that time there was no public water system to that part of Hawarden. So he had installed in the kitchen the first pump and a large zinc tank in the attic. Made a wonderful place for we children to play hide and seek in and to hide Christmas presents, things of that sort. And it was quite large. It must have been about 3 feet high and maybe 3 feet wide and 4 or 5 feet long. Had a wooden cover over it and so on. And as I remember it, the banker had a hired man whose job it was to fill that tank each morning. And the first pump, which had a big bulge in the top of it, to get pressure to force the water up, forced it up into the tank. The house was really almost a 3-story house, and he was able to get the tank full because of the pressure from the first pump. Many houses had outdoor pumps. Some houses had indoor pumps, and of course in some parts of Hawarden there was a water system by this time. I suppose all the houses in Hawarden at first were supplied with their own pump, but later on they were hooked up with a municipal water system. I think Frank Schoeneman had a pump in their backyard. B.T. French, I believe, had a pump in his backyard, and we had a pump in our yard, and most of them did. Most of the houses had outdoor toilets as well as indoor toilets. We were over on the eastern side of the hill, just over the top of it, and so at first we could not belong to the municipal sewer system because there was no lift station in that area and so on. So we had to have a couple of what today would be called septic tanks for storing of the sewage. We had 2 large septic tanks which we used well, I guess all through my high school period and so on. These were kept filled. One of the things that I might make a comment about, because I did see some of it when I came back to Hawarden during the drought years, was the grasshopper epidemic that occurred in the early 1930s. It's hard for anybody today to realize that grasshoppers could have been as much of a pest as they were in those 2 or 3 years. Today we have much better control of grasshoppers than then. But grasshoppers were everywhere. They literally did eat the paint off of houses, and they literally did eat harness and things like that that were hung on fence posts. I've seen all of those things happening. They were about the size of one's little finger. They had wings and were just everywhere. My mother hated them like poison. Down at Elk Point, South Dakota, there were quite a lot of French Canadians and French that had lived there, French Catholics. They had been settled in there during the grasshopper years in the 1870s, 1880s, and so on. And at that time, the Catholics had held a march around the boundary lines of the parish where they'd set up stations of the cross. And so the priest of this parish in the 1930s led his parish on a march around from one station of the cross to the next, going over the boundary lines of the parish. One thing that I might comment on was the fact that the Edison Phonograph Company, with its diamond disc phonograph records, used to put on performances in which they brought in some fairly good singer, probably past her prime as a singer, but nevertheless she had a good voice and a good reputation. And the Edison Phonograph, they would put her behind the screen and the phonograph behind the screen, and then they'd put on a demonstration in which you were to guess when the singer was singing and when the phonograph was playing. The point being that the reproduction was so faithful that it was very difficult, if not impossible, to tell when it was the singer and when it was the phonograph. I attended a couple of those demonstrations. I think Sumner's furniture store had the Edison Phonograph franchise, and the demonstrations were usually in the Associated Church, and it was very difficult to tell which person was singing.